let us get to chapter 8 of the book of Daniel, and I need to share my screen with you so you can see what we're doing. In chapter 8 of Daniel, we switch back to the Hebrew language. So chapter 1 is Hebrew, 2 through 7, Aramaic. Now back 8 through 12 will be Hebrew. Why is the book of Daniel written that way? The scholars who really study this, the experts in the Old Testament and the book of Daniel have ideas, but I think it's really anyone's guess. It's just something that eludes us. Now, starting with chapter 8, we're getting to this question. When we think about all the troubles, the oppression, the affliction that the people of Israel have been through in the exile and after the exile. So the Babylonian exile that starts, I'll just use 586 BC. Sometimes it's either 586 or 587. Starting in 586, the people of God are living in exile, many of them. Jerusalem has been destroyed, the temple's been destroyed. And so how do you be God's people when you don't have sacrifice, you don't have the rituals, you don't have access to the places of worship? You're not, now you're living among the Gentiles. You're living again among the pagans. How do you remain a faithful Jew? And are we just stuck this way forever, or is God going to do something to save us, to restore us? So what we get in the book of Daniel is this, we see these promises or a vision that God will act. The question is, when? When will God act? And we're getting in chapters 8 through 12 glimpses of an understanding of when will God act. But we're encountering a mixture of historical references and visionary experiences with an intentional literary style or device, and that is the style of apocalyptic. Apocalyptic writings they're cosmic in scope. They're extremely vivid symbols, like we're looking at these beasts, and some of them are monstrous in their appearance. And so you're getting these big symbols, and they have many facets. So they can evoke many different kinds of understandings and interpretations. That makes it hard to pin down the kind of historical, chronological, geographical details that we'd like to have, but that's what we're working with. So when will God act is a major question now that we're asking through the remainder of the book of Daniel. Now, this first slide has a lot of stuff in it. So 27 verses. I think if it's okay, I'm just going to read the chapter, and then we'll start to unpack it. Obviously, there's much we can't uncover, but let me just read it, and then we'll start looking at specifics. I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, and he's a Persian king, a Babylonian king, Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that had appeared to me at first. Right away, that's a reference back to chapter 7. So the vision we have in chapter 7, we'll continue to interact with it a little bit in chapter 8, verse 2. In the vision, I was looking and saw myself in Susa, the capital. Now, Susa is the capital of Persia. So we have Babylonia and Persia kind of mixed in here right at the beginning. I saw myself in Susa, the capital, in the province of Elam, and I was by the river Ulai. I looked up and saw a ram standing beside the river. It had 2 horns. Both horns were long, but one was longer than the other, and the longer one came up second. I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. All beasts were powerless to withstand it, and no one could rescue from its power. It did as it pleased and became strong. Do you notice the kind of repetition there, redundancy a little bit in that one verse? When the writer does that, it's not poor writing, it's a way of emphasizing. As I was watching, a male goat appeared from the west, coming across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. The goat had a horn between its eyes. It came toward the ram with the 2 horns that I had seen standing beside the river, and it ran at it with savage force. I saw it approaching the ram. It was enraged against it and struck the ram, breaking its 2 horns. The ram did not have power to withstand it. It threw the ram down to the ground and trampled upon it, and there was no one who could rescue the ram from its power. Then the male goat grew exceedingly great, but at the height of its power, the great horn was broken. And in its place, there came up 4 prominent horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. Now, if you go back in chapter 7, you'll see the 4 winds of heaven, you'll see the 4 beasts, all that. Verse 9, out of one of them came another horn, a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. It grew as high as the host of heaven. It threw down to the earth some of the host and some of the stars, and trampled on them. Even against the prince of the host, it acted arrogantly. It took the regular burnt offering away from him and overthrew the place of his sanctuary. Because of the wickedness, the host was given over to it together with the regular burnt offering. It cast truth to the ground and kept prospering in what it did. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one that spoke, for how long is this vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and host to be trampled? How long? And he answered, for 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I tried to understand it. Then, having the appearance of a man, and I heard a human voice by the Ulai calling, Gabriel, help this man understand the vision. So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I became frightened and fell prostrate. But he said to me, understand, O mortal, that the vision is for the time of the end. Now that's tantalizing language. The time of the end times. And this is where we begin to get all kinds of interest in end times scenarios. Now, what is the reference to the time of the end? What end are we talking about? It may be something fairly close in historical proximity. It may be further down the road, but this is the place where we'd say you can't pin down in a way that eliminates all the other good possibilities. So the time of the end, verse 18. As he was speaking to me, I fell into a trance, face to the ground. Then he touched me and set me on my feet. So this vision is really overwhelming to Daniel. He said, listen, and I will tell you what will take place later in the period of wrath. For it refers to the appointed time of the end. As for the ram that you saw with the 2 horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. The male goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn between its eyes is the first king. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power, or with its power, his power. Now we switch into kind of poetic language. At the end of their rule, when the transgressions have reached their full measure, a king of bold countenance shall arise, skilled in intrigue. He shall grow strong in power, shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does. He shall destroy the powerful and the people of the holy ones. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall be great. Without warning he shall destroy many, and shall even rise up against the prince of princes. But he shall be broken, and not by human hands. The vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true. As for you, Daniel, seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. So I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. Then I arose and went about the king's business. But I was dismayed by the vision and did not understand it. Wow, there's just so much in here. So I just gonna say this and get it off my chest. And one of the things that I would love for us to have the time to do, but I think it would maybe prolong this study longer than it should. But there are places in the book of Isaiah. There are places in the book of Ezekiel. There are places in the book of Zechariah where it appears that the book of Daniel is using some of the same or very similar images. It's almost like Daniel might be borrowing from these other prophets and related to some of the same issues. If you think about Ezekiel chapter 1 through 3, you get this really strange vision of this throne and the living creatures around the throne, and the throne has wheels on it, and they kind of turn every direction all at the same time, and lots of eyes in the wheels. And so if we could look at those other scriptures, Isaiah 14 about the king of Babylon and how he he throws down these stars from heaven and does some. So we get the use of a common stock of images that we find in Daniel, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Zechariah. All right, get that out of the way. Now, in chapter 8, verse 1, we can see that we get here an extension of chapter 7. So let's go back and refresh our memories. Let's go back to chapter 7 and look at verses 3 through 7. And you'll read there about 4 great beasts. And we get a certain kind of description there, a lion, an eagle, a bear, so on, a leopard. And the 4th beast gets more description, and it's more terrifying than the others. So switch over to chapter 8, verse 22. That's not exactly a repeat. This is like augmentation. But here in 8:22, as for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms. So 4 beasts, 4 horns. Horn is the symbol of kingly power, authority. So it's like the power of a nation. 4 kingdoms, 4 beasts, 4 kingdoms, 4 horns. Now, back to chapter 7, verse 8. I was considering the horns when another horn appeared, a little one, coming up among them. To make room for it, 3 of the earlier horns were plucked up by the roots, so on. Now, chapter 8, verse 9. Out of one of them, out of the horns, came another horn, a little one, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. And that is the horn that gets most of the attention again in chapter 8. So very similar to chapter 7, with a sort of, we're now supplementing that vision in chapter 7 with other characteristics in chapter 8. Please make a comment or ask a question at any point. I'm going to rattle on here, but you can stop me. I'm glad for the interruption. Now, chapter 8, verses 3 and 4. We read about the ram that has 2 horns. They're both long, but one is longer. And then in verse 20, we learn that ram with the 2 horns is the Medo-Persian Empire. The Medes and the Persians, eventually the Persians overtake. It's a joint empire with Persian kings becoming the rulers. Okay, so what we're talking about now is the 6th century. So this is after Babylon. The next power in this picture is the Medo-Persian Empire. All right. Now the goat with 1 horn, verse 5, chapter 8. As I was watching, a male goat appeared from the west, coming across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. The goat had a horn between its eyes. It came toward the ram with the 2 horns that I had seen standing beside the river. It ran with savage force. Approaching the ram, it was enraged against it, struck the ram, breaking its 2 horns. The ram did not have power, and so on. Now, verse 21. The male goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn between its eyes is the first king. Now, many scholars see the reference to the king of Greece here as Alexander the Great. I may not have the exact year here, but somewhere around 334 BC, Alexander the Great started his military campaigns and he conquered massive amounts of territory. And his first big battle was with Persia, Darius III, so the king of Greece is coming from the west, so from Greece into Turkey and then on into, okay. And it is true that Alexander operated with the strategy of surprise. He had a much smaller army. He attacked at a time when you're really not supposed to start the battles. He did a bunch of things to gain strategic advantage so that coming across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground, the army moved as quickly as you can make an army that size move. So again, these descriptions like that, scholars say it's a symbolic description of Alexander the Great and the military strategy he had employed to conquer Darius. If Alexander's battle with Persia could be a professional football game with color commentators, the commentator would have not anticipated these moves on Alexander's part, and he would have said, the commentator would have said, that's really foolish to do that, but it worked. Right? It's that kind of thing. It's very risky, very fast, very aggressive, and it worked. Nobody expected them to beat this mighty Persian army, and they did. But Alexander the Great died in 323. He was less 30 years old or less, or around 30 years old. And the cause of his death is ultimately unknown. Did he get a fever that came from a wound? Because he was wounded several times in battle. Was it a fever from a wound? Something like that? Nobody knows. Or he just got sick and died. All right. Now, Daniel, the character that we've been reading about in this book, this goes back to the Babylonian time. And we have here a reference to Belshazzar, the third year of the king of Belshazzar. So we could say, well, Daniel's seeing the future. Because that's in the 500s, where Daniel is in terms of the history of Babylonia and Persia and all that, sort of in the 500s, and he's seeing into the 300s. So a couple of hundred years in advance. This is why a lot of scholars, including, I'll use the term evangelical scholars. So these are scholars who they believe that there is predictive prophecy. They believe God does reveal the future to prophets. However, if you look at the biblical prophecies of the future, they're not as detailed as these prophecies are. And so anyway, even scholars who are open to predictive prophecy and all that, when they read these texts, they think, no, it's not quite like these other prophecies. When Jeremiah talks about the new covenant, for example, in chapter 31, and they'll all know me from the least of them to the greatest of them. That's a glorious vision. Doesn't have a lot of detail in it. But here you get the king of the Medes and the Persian, the king of Greece. So I'd say probably the majority view among scholars is that what we have here is a literary device to talk about what's actually happening in the present. But again, this is not a way of weaseling out of the possibility that he actually could be seeing the future. I'm just telling you what I pick up from working on these things. All right, now we get to the succeeding four horns. So that horn is broken, the horn of the king of Greece, his power is broken. Alexander the Great dies. In the place of that one horn are four other horns, four kingdoms. Now, since Alexander had no surviving male heir, he had one son who died as a teenager, right?
It was a grandson. Oh, no, it was a son.
It was Alexander's son, not Philip's.
Yes. Yeah, that died as a teenager.
As a teenager. Johnny's been to the grave of that son. So, okay. So Alexander had no surviving male heirs, so he deeded his empire to four of his military generals. And we're going to look at a map in just a second, a couple of maps. Out of those four, one, a little horn, so a couple of generations later, one of the heirs of one of the kingdoms takes over and expands his territory. And that little horn is generally understood to be Antiochus IV, also known as Epiphanes. So we're going to spend a little time looking at that. Now, before we move on, what happens to all these horns and beasts and all that? What happens to them? So look back at 7, 25, and 26. So there's real persecution, there's real tribulation, but then against God's people. But then in 26, then the court shall sit in judgment. Remember that court scene with the Ancient of Days and one like a son of man presented? There's the reference to that. Then the court shall sit in judgment, and his dominion, the horn's dominion, will be taken away, shall be taken away, to be consumed and totally destroyed. Now look at 825b. So talking about the same horn, most likely, 825b. That he shall be broken and not by human hands. So this is a big theme in these last chapters of Daniel. God is sovereign. God's kingdom will last forever. These kingdoms that we're looking at, they have a lot of power. They can do damage. This one kingdom is especially evil. Not all these kingdoms really are evil, but this one is really evil. But they're all going to come to an end because God's kingdom, Yahweh's kingdom, lasts forever. Okay. Here's one of the maps I want to show you.
He will become very strong and not by his own power.
Right. So even there, you know,
That's
sovereign God permits it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Verse 24.
Yeah. Okay, the four kingdoms.
Yeah, just say that.
We have Greece, Macedonia, there's one. So one of the four commanders got that territory. The orange is another kingdom. Then this yellow is the Medo-Persian kingdom that Seleucus I, who's one of the four generals, this map doesn't show everything I'd like it to show, but he's got a big chunk of territory. But down here in the lower left, where it kind of blends in with the blue, you can see it says Aegyptus or Egypt. Ptolemy is the general who got that area. And the area of Palestine is disputed territory between those two kingdoms. Eventually, Egypt, the Ptolemaic Empire or kingdom, is going to lose out. They're going to lose territory to this Seleucid kingdom under Antiochus IV. But when you look, if you look at all the colors together, green, orange, yellow, and this blue down here in the left-hand corner, that's Alexander's empire. And it goes over to the Indus River, which is India. And that's a lot of territory that he conquered before he died. Okay, so, you know, kind of the majority view of scholars studying this material really see Daniel 8 talking about, these are the four kingdoms. Now, Rome isn't in here, and that's, again, if you go on the internet and look for stuff about Daniel, you're going to run into Rome as well.
Russia.
Yeah, I mean, that's what you get. Okay, let me move on to another map. Whoops. This is a modern day map, and it's not as, the yellow lines could be brighter and clearer, but this is a modern map. Here we have, you see where it says Damascus over here on the left side of the map, and there's Jerusalem, there's Amman, Jordan. So there's that strip of land back here. So that strip of land right there, right here, you can see, you know, here's the Gaza Strip right in there. Then we have Syria, which would have been the old Assyria. And then we have Babylonia, see Babylon on there, in Iraq. And then there's Susa over there. So you get the Persian, so that's Iran. So this is a modern map with modern names on it, with also a few of the historic names. Because those, I mean, you know, they are still cities, even if they go by other names now or other forms of the name. Interesting, isn't it? You know, Iran just shot some missiles at Israel, and And it's just really interesting that this is all still contested territory. Now, in the books of Maccabees, so these are the deuterocanonical books or the apocryphal books. Here's what Antiochus IV actually has done in Jerusalem. This is according to 2 Maccabees. Not long after this, the king sent an Athenian senator to compel the Jews to forsake the laws of their fathers and cease to live by the laws of God, and also to pollute the temple in Jerusalem and call it the temple of Olympian Zeus, and to call the one in Gerizim the temple of Zeus, the friend of strangers, as did the people who dwelt in that place. Harsh and utterly grievous was the onslaught of evil, for the temple was filled with debauchery and reveling by the Gentiles, who dallied with harlots and had intercourse with women within the sacred precincts, and besides brought in things for sacrifice that were unfit. The altar was covered with abominable offerings, which were forbidden by the laws. A man could neither keep the Sabbath nor observe the feasts of his fathers, nor so much as confess himself to be a Jew. Now imagine being a Jew and living in those conditions. Now, if we go back to chapter 8 in Daniel, what does it say? Verse 11, chapter 8. Even against the prince of the host it acted arrogantly. It took the regular burnt offering away from him and overthrew the place of his sanctuary. Because of wickedness, the host was given over to it together with the regular burnt offering. It cast truth to the ground and kept prospering in what it did. So there's a little glimpse in Daniel that the temple practices ceased. And historians know also from Maccabees, and we'll look at that in just a second, from 167 BC to 164 BC, this is what happened. What we read in 2 Maccabees actually took place in the temple area during those years when Antiochus IV ruled and had this, he wanted to Hellenize the Jews. So here's a little interesting thing. I think it's interesting. You notice what it said in that previous slide about Olympian Zeus. So let's think like pagans for a moment. Every one of these nations had its pantheon of deities. And with the Greek Empire, you have the export of Greek gods, Greek language, Greek customs, Greek forms of dress, all that. This is what we know as Hellenization. So then you have the Greek gods like Zeus, he's the supreme god. You have the Syrian god, go back to the map. The supreme Syrian god is Baal. You have the supreme Jewish God, Yahweh. So if I'm the king of Greece, I'll just shorthand it that way. If I'm the king of Greece, well, we have Zeus, they have Yahweh, it's the same God, right? Same God. Supreme God, it's the same God. We'll just sort of mix and match. And that actually is a common practice because remember, these involve political alliances as well. So if I recognize the legitimacy of your God and the God that you believe is your most supreme God is just like the God that we believe is the most supreme God, we can just say it's the same God. You'll call him that, you'll call him that, and we'll get along just fine because that's what makes the realm stable and peaceful. So imagine Antiochus, he thinks he's doing the right thing perhaps by introducing these Gentile practices into the temple area and forbidding the Jews to practice their own religion because he knows if he lets them do that, they're gonna remain independent, they're gonna remain recalcitrant. They don't wanna get along with anybody. So that's what's going on here. And that quote from Second Maccabees, I think, is very telling. But you can imagine the abomination of desolations, right? The temple area has been desecrated by all kinds of evil and immoral practices.
Can I ask a question? And I'm ignorant about this, but the desecration that whatever, was there a moral code from Antiochus? Was there any prohibition against, I mean, the Jews had a very structured, clear moral
Yeah.
code.
Yeah,
The people of the book, they know what it says.
right.
Did Antiochus, did they have one? I mean, what, or was it wasn't?
This is really a great question, and I hope I can convey with this answer a very critical distinction. It is true that these nations, we have the Code of Hammurabi, for example. So these nations had laws and they had rules that said this behavior is right and that's wrong, right? So there is a moral code in that sense. But here's the difference between these other codes and a Jewish understanding of morality and ethics. The king, I'll just use Antiochus, the king of the nation, Antiochus thought he was God manifest, right? Epiphanes. He thought he was God manifest. So the king rules as if with divine power. So what's right and what is wrong is really what the king says. And right and wrong behavior is related to the behaviors that show your loyalty to the state and the way you get along with other people who are subjects of that realm. So there is a right and wrong, obviously, but the right and wrong, the rules focus on those kinds of things. So, there were marriage laws and all that out of an attempt to have peace and stability within the nation. With the Jews and with Yahweh, and this is really introducing something entirely unprecedented. So with Jews, there's only one God. There's not a pantheon of gods. There's only one God. And that God, Yahweh, created everything. There's only one God. Now, again, there's ways of qualifying what I'm saying. There's only one God. And because that God created all peoples, then right and wrong is based on accountability to that God. Because if that God created everything, he must have a purpose in creating. So we get the kind of the beginning of a kind of ethics associated with there's really only one God. And this is a gift of the Jews to the world.
Mm-hmm.
And in Israel, the king is accountable to those rules because God is the ultimate king. So King David, he gets talked to by Nathan the prophet as one who is subject to the law of God, who is the ultimate king. So even the king in Israel is subject to the law, subject to right and wrong. So the moral code in Israel develops around this sense of accountability to God, who is good and who is holy and who has a will. And everybody answers to that God ultimately. So I hope I was able to get across the kind of quality of morality that appears with Israel, and that really is something new. Even though other lands have codes and moral values and systems, they're just different. Okay, ready to move on? Okay, we have 2,300 evenings and mornings. So let's get into some of the numbers. How do you read these numbers? So remember, we just talked about the morning and evening the sacrifices. They stopped the sacrifices. Well, in Jewish tradition, there's a morning and an evening sacrifice. And in Jewish tradition, it's evening and morning, right? There's one day is evening and morning, just like Genesis 1. So we have 2,300 sacrifices in we have 2 sacrifices in a 24-hour period, and we have 2,300 evenings and mornings. Is that 1,150 days? Or is it 2,300 days? Yeah, we get, the answer is yes. I mean, you get people who say either. And it is the case that, so 1,150 days is about 3 years. So when it says, for how long is this vision concerning the regular burnt offering, etc.? How long? Well, 2,300 evenings and mornings. That's maybe about 3 years. And sure enough, what?
It just says, I'm interested in that evenings and mornings, or, because in the King James Version, it just says days. 2,300 days.
Yeah. It's an interpretation, just like, right? Okay, but you get this kind of, there's a pretty nice fit when we look at this period of time, 167 to 164. What Daniel says in chapter 8 fits really nicely with what's going on during the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes. Now we go back to 725, and we see that, this is my version again, a time, 2 times, and half a time. Is that 3.5 years? So it's not a perfect numerical match, but it's pretty close. Then look at 8:14. Then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. And one way of interpreting the rightful state is the sanctuary will be justified. It will be cleansed. It will be purified. And that is what happened in 164. Now, I'm sorry for I couldn't figure out how to. Sometimes using these different internet sources, you can get it to match the way, like the other one did from Second Maccabees, and sometimes with my limited technical skills, I can't figure it out. So now we're going to go back and read a little bit more about what happened to go along with that 167, 164. So this is from First Maccabees. Yeah, there should be a colon there. It's chapter 1, verses 54 through 61. Now, on the 15th day of Kislev, in the 145th year, they erected a desolating sacrilege on the altar of burnt offering. So that's the altar, the high altar outside the temple building proper, where the sacrifice is made morning and evening. A desolating sacrilege, like sacrificing a pig, spilling a pig's blood on the altar. They also built altars in the surrounding towns of Judah and offered incense at the doors of the houses and in the streets. The books of the law that they found, they tore to pieces and burned with fire. Anyone found possessing the book of the covenant, or anyone who adhered to the law, was condemned to death by decree of the king. They kept using violence against Israel, against those who were found month after month in the towns. On the 25th day of the month, they offered sacrifice on the altar that was on top of the altar of burnt offering. According to the decree, they put to death the women who had their children circumcised and their families and those who circumcised them. And they hung the infants from their mothers' necks. I mean, this is a extremely violent way of trying to get these Jews to come to heel.
October 7th.
Yeah, and is Daniel, is, so. I think the
I'm not
majority of
saying it
scholars,
like that, but it sounds the same.
yeah, it's kind of raping and murdering, yeah, yeah. So, again, I think majority scholars believe that Daniel is describing these events. And one more, short one. Early in the morning on the 25th day of the 9th month, which is the month of Kislev, in the 148th year, they rose and offered sacrifice as the law directs. So this is in 164, right? This is when the Maccabees lead a revolt, and and the Seleucids are overthrown. And so they start the proper sacrifice again. They rose and offered sacrifice as the law directs on the new altar of burnt offering that they had built. New altar. Okay, so in that previous slide, it was 148th year, and here it's 145th year. Here it's 148th year, so about a 3-year period. Now, if you look at chapter 8 again, verse 26, the vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true. What's going on? All right, the last two things I want to say, and then if you have any kind of wrap up, questions or comments. One of the things Daniel is teaching us, and we could look at those verses again, the nation's powers ultimately fade, falter, and are broken. Every one of the beasts, every one of the horns, sooner or later fails. That's a major theme in the book of Daniel. So whether or not, and this is where I think the sort of spiritual principle for us starts to show up, whether or not we can pinpoint who's this beast, what's that about, what does this number mean? If we can't nail that down with 100% precision, what we can see for sure is that Daniel is telling us Yahweh the Lord is king. He's the eternal king. His rule is forever. And these kingdoms, these powers, these beasts, these horns, they can do a lot of damage, but they won't last. And that conviction is comforting for people who are suffering. This is not just a psychological trick. This isn't just positive thinking. This is a firm commitment to the reality of one true God who oversees all things. So then, on the other side of that, human power that does not recognize and honor God's transcendent power always overreaches and ultimately collapses. Now, this one makes me think about power like in our own United States culture, powers that get exercised they're not military power, they're not police power, they might be rhetorical power, they might be the power of social change advocates who want it a certain way. And if you look at history, the movements that disregard a transcendent moral authority. Now we can have diverse opinions about that transcendent moral authority, but if I think that the almighty autonomous individual is the ultimate power, sooner or later, there's going to be overreach and the whole thing comes crashing down. And we can, the big ones in the 20th century are Hitler and the Soviet Union.
Maybe God lets things go so long, and then that's it.
Right.
Mhm.
And I do think that's where we could recognize a reference to the end as, at some point, when God says we're wrapping it up, it will be the end, right? even if we don't know when that is, and this is why Jesus says, no one knows the day or the hour, but everybody be alert, right?
Mhm.
Well, I know this is like saying exactly what you're saying, only a different way, but I think that, that it is for our own good that we recognize a transcendent God. It's not because God is power hungry or, it's for our own good. Because left to our own devices, which is the opposite of recognizing a transcendent loving God, we do things like what Hitler did. And in a sense, we get what we asked for.
Right,
Not that God is
yeah,
sending the thunderbolt. It's that God is allowing our own demise, which is what happens to us when we usurp God's.
right. So there is a moral order deeply written into the fabric of the universe, and it's God's transcendent moral order. And if I rise up in rebellion against that moral order, I can only hurt myself.
And a lot of people around you.
And a lot of
Yeah,
it, and a lot of
yeah,
people, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So I appreciate your take on this. 'Cause this is something that I've been looking for a long time, is how do we boil it down to what the truth is, what the essence is of these apocalyptic books? We can argue over what all these symbols mean, but what is the author really trying to communicate? So I appreciate that.
good. Well, and I'm just channeling other people's thoughts, I'm just trying to get this right too. Yeah, and if you go back and read closely, you'll see how often references to power, not being able to withstand the power, things like that. There's a lot of repetition in these books that helps us. If we could do a really close, detailed study, we could start to notice those things and begin to see the major themes coming out in the book. It's easy, for me, I get kind of enamored with these vivid symbols. What does that mean? What is that white stone in the book of Revelation? Your name is going to be written on a white stone. What in the world is that? Stuff like that. Yeah. All right, any other thoughts?
Is Allah God? Is Allah our?
Is Allah the same as our God?
Mhm.
See, so did you hear that question? Is Allah the same as God? So my take on that is Muslims are monotheists, Jews are monotheists, Christians are monotheists. So we all believe that there's only one God. But our thoughts about the nature of that God are dramatically different. And this is where Jews and Muslims are Unitarian and Christians are Trinitarian. And so when we think of God, our reference is to Father, Son, and Spirit, which is just fundamentally different than Jews and Muslims. So I think you can sort of flex with the idea that we all worship the same God. There's something in that's worth thinking about. But there's a very bright line dividing a Christian understanding of God from the other two. And if God really is Trinity, then a Unitarian God isn't God. That's really hard to say because we learned about God from the Jews. So that's it's tricky. It's tricky. And I would want to try to finesse the answer, which I'm not very good at that. Okay, friends. Okay, next week I am in Seattle for a conference, a training thing, but I'm going to try to stick with it'll be 5 o'clock there, 7 o'clock here. I think I can go ahead and do a session, but we'll all be on Zoom. Right? But I'd like, especially since I missed last week, I'd like to try to keep going. So let's plan on next week, and then if for some reason I can't make it work, I'll let you know in time, but nobody's traveling, so it wouldn't be as bad as if you showed up here and nothing's happening, right?
Could we meet an hour later if it would benefit you?
Actually, it's good for me to meet at 5,
Okay.
because there's a little window in there, between things. I think I can pull it off.
Okay.
Well, we do chapter 9 then?
Yeah, let's go on to chapter 9. Okay. We'll see you, friends.